Conflict and resolution are two sides of the same coin. Harish Sippy. Welcome to the Dispute Management in the New World podcast. 40 minutes of bi-weekly conversations with Dr. Christopher Malcolm, dispute management practitioner and Secretary General of the Jamaica International Arbitration Center. I'm your host, Roxene Nickle. Today, our conversation focuses on financing development in emerging economies, policy investment, and disputes resolution. Hello, Dr. Malcolm.
How are you, Rox?
I am well. So let's get right into it. Sustainable development is a major goal, both in the macro and micro levels in the countries, in all economies. So why do we need to focus on that in relation to dispute management?
Any mechanisms that you put in place to support development will necessarily involve a series of connected contracts. You will, for example, let's say you're building a road, which is a development initiative. In that road project, you will have, let's say it's been supported by the government being the developer of the road. The government will engage contractors who will design the road, provide engineering services, provide contractor service, and at each stage, you will have a main contractor with subcontractors and with all sorts of other persons involved. And the hope is that by building that new road, you will open up areas of your country, which will become more accessible for development purposes. People can build new homes, they can build new villages, they can build new towns, they can build new cities, they can do a host of things around it. Now, what is critical in that, as I just mentioned, is that you have a series of connected contracts. And for each contract, you have parties, and the moment you have parties, you have the possibility of conflict. And the moment you have possibility of conflict, you have a need for settling those conflicts or resolving them. So dispute management comes into the core of that. And of course, if we were to take that a little further, the project itself will have various components, some of which are financial, some of which are social, some of which are cultural. So let's say, for example, you're thinking of building a road through a forest reserve.
Right.
Then the question is, what are the climatic or other environmental factors to consider? Are there rare animals here that need to be taken care of? And so, start thinking of cultural rights, start thinking of people who benefit from hunting animals, for example, in that area. And of course, the question is, how do you finance it? You start thinking of financing. Do you go to a bank to source financing? Do you have persons coming in, bringing equity into the project? And again, at all of those levels, be it of a financial nature or otherwise, you have the possibility of conflicts, therefore the need for resolution, therefore the need for dispute management.
Just like what we're having now through the cockpit countries and what is happening, we have flora and fauna. You believe that if they had probably gone that route, we're assuming that would have made it better if they sat down and looked at the issues that could occur. It would have not reached to the stage where we have all these demonstrations and persons who are within the community are having these issues.
There's always a conflict between development and retention of sociocultural artifacts and so on. I recall, for example, if I were to Jamaicanize it a bit, I recall, for example, many years ago, when they were thinking of expanding the road in Ligani. And that expansion, at the time, there was a big guango tree that was in the road. And I recall a former minister who was then responsible for utilities and public works saying, if I must go to my grave with the guango tree on my chest, this guango tree is going down. And the guango tree went. And I recall years ago, for example, similarly, in Barbados, at this point on the west coast where they have now built a development, I won't call it the name of the entity that is there, there were a number of cotton trees and other older trees that were there, which were supposedly there from the point Barbados always was. And that development required that those trees, if it were to happen at that point, that the trees be moved, and the trees were in fact moved. And there was, of course, a big public uproar about it as to whether or not you should be getting rid of something that has always been there and is a part of the cultural and social retention of Barbados.
Right.
But at the end of the day, a decision was made that while we want to retain, we also recognize that there are things which we're going to have to move and things that we're going to have to change. So we cannot fool ourselves into thinking that the development process is always as simple as, well, I want to do something, I do it. Or as simple as, we want to retain these things, therefore we retain them. Because there's always that conflict. And the question is, how do you best manage it so that you do not develop and spoil the future of the rest of everybody else? Because that is really the battle, you know. The battle is, while you're thinking of now, how do you preserve for the future?
So now, while we're talking about development, what is meant by the term developmental agenda?
Well, the developmental agenda is there were prior to 2015, there were a series of Millennium goals, for example, if you think in the UN context, that were established as to what they thought persons should be aspiring to in terms of trying to get people to a point where they felt their development needs were well beyond simply growth, but more in terms of sustainability and in terms of looking at the whole person and whole economies. Subsequent to that, you had the post-Millennium Goals objective under the post-2015 agenda. It is not simply about putting up increasing number of high rises or putting up increasing numbers of 6-lane highways or whatever the number may be. It is about saying that we have people, and as we develop, we must ensure a number of things. One is that we are making life better for persons, and we're trying to elevate all persons whereby we don't leave anybody behind. So let's leave no one behind. That's part of that agenda. And of course, the other part to that is to say, as we develop, how do we ensure that we are future-proofing our economies from adverse impacts of climate change, from adverse impact of overbuilding on arable lands, which should be probably preserved for agriculture. Those are the sorts of contending things that we now have to look to, because the reality is you could develop without proper consideration, where you develop and you get a lot of immediate gains, but lose out on a lot of what the future is about. So the development agenda is one which recognizes that it's not simply about gross domestic product, which we normally do measure in, as to what the economy grew relative to last year and the rest of it and so on. It's a question of how are we growing as we develop, with our people in mind, with our future in mind, and with ensuring that we don't have lopsidedness in the development process. Do we always achieve it? No, we don't. And the truth is that what we have also seen is that notwithstanding these very well laid out goals and objectives, we still see in many societies a widening gap between rich and poor. Is that consistent with the development agenda that the UN aspires to? It is not. So there are issues, of course, as we think about financing, as we think about development. I typically say be considered to be utopian, but the truth is you have to sometimes consider utopia as a point of possible departure, and then to see how it is that you can develop with a view to trying to get to utopia as closely as possible, even though you will never achieve it. Because at the end of the day, if we're not careful, as has happened in our history, you could have a situation where you develop, some persons benefit, others don't, and then what you have, radical action. We know of the Bolshevik revolution, we know of the French Revolution, we know of all of these things that have happened. And in the context of the Caribbean, we know of our slave uprisings. The one I remember most always is the 1833-1834 Christmas Rebellion, where Sam Shaw proudly said, "I'd rather die on yonder gallows than live the life of a slave." What happened then? You had plantations burned to the ground. And why did that happen? Because there were persons in the field working to sustain an economy for persons who were in the great houses. And they were seeing that there was inequity, and seeing that their own goals and aspirations were not being met. So the whole idea of development, if we're to think it properly, is to find a happy medium where you don't have this disparity and therefore persons wanting to burn the great house down. We really have to aspire to a development agenda which is much more inclusive. So inclusiveness as well become a critical part of any development agenda that is worthwhile.
In staying with the developmental agenda, can you speak to how it may differ from country to country and regions?
Well, the difference is always going, there are questions about stages of development as well. So when you start thinking about economic development, In addition to thinking of what you're aspiring to, you also have to recognize that development is a process where you measure from where you start to where you aspire. And countries come to the process at different stages. We've heard people talk about, countries which are third world, countries which are first world, countries which are emerging economies. We've heard all of these labels. I myself try to avoid them. But the fact is that what we do know is that not every country has the same level of development in terms of the resources that are available.
Right.
There are some countries which have better clean drinking water than others. There are some countries which have better toilet systems than others. As basis that we can get there. So the question is, if you're going to a country where the sanitation system is poor, you may find that a critical development requirement is that you improve the sanitation system. Why? Because if your sanitation system is not good, you have seepage into your drinking water. You have all sorts of waterborne illnesses that may come out of that. So there is having to be, in each case, a nuanced approach to look and say, we're in this economy. What are the specific needs that they have? And how do we nuance our approach to get there? And we also have to recognize that what may be good for one economy at a particular point in time may not be good for another. So it is important as we look at the broad objectives that we understand them to be broad objectives that we should have as aspirational goals, but recognize that depending on where you are, it may take you a shorter or a longer time to get there, and it may always take and also take a different path to getting you to that aspirational goal that you have.
Awesome. So we're looking at reasons for caution in the mapping of the developmental agenda. Can you give us some clarity on that?
The first mapping caution I think we should have is to recognize firstly that one size does not fit all. That's a first and significant mapping caution. Another mapping caution is to believe that you can simply lift a development plan from one country, take it to another, and plant it without reference to the local population. And we see that happening all the time, And I myself think it to be an arrogant approach to take. Because the fact that something works in one place doesn't mean it works in another. We who grew up in Jamaica, for example, know the saying, 7 brothers, 7 different minds.
Right.
And all that means is that the fact even that you're brought up in the same household, with the same nutrition, with the same other factors around, does not necessarily mean that you will all end up in the same way. Because there are other factors which are inherent to who you are as an individual. Our DNAs are different, other things about us are different.
Right.
And it's the same way with countries. Countries have their own DNA, their own socio-historical points of departure. And as you look to them, you must say, yes, here are some broad prescriptions that we can consider, but it must always be done, if we're talking about the cautions continuing, where you understand that it is not ever sufficient for persons to arrogantly think that because I have had a formula which works here, I must simply lift it, take it elsewhere, and it works. And we've seen enough of that. We have seen it through the international financial institutions. We've seen it in a number of other ways where persons believe that a prescription for one country will necessarily work in another. And we have seen it work very well in some and disastrously in others. So we have to bear in mind, if I were to just repeat it a bit because it's that important, that we must consider countries where they are, consider people where they are, consider that we have stages of development that differ, and therefore that the prescriptions as devised must recognize that. But more importantly, you should never devise a prescription for anybody without having mature dialogue with them. And we should never think that anybody or any jurisdiction or anything is ever so uninformed and uneducated that they cannot understand. Because the truth is, if it is that you're unable to have the persons understand what you're saying, so that they can make it relevant to them. Perhaps it is that what you're trying to prescribe for them is not for them in the first place anyway.
Exactly.
Because if they do not buy into what you're proposing, chances are they will not give it the level of support it requires. And without their level of support, it is unlikely that it is going to achieve the objectives you're hoping for.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. So let's now look at policy and what are some of the possible conundrums that emerging economies are facing?
Well, one of the big conundrums comes about because most emerging economies, or a lot of them anyway, rely on the savings of other countries to sustain and support their own development. So in the context of the Caribbean, since we're here, or any of the small island developing states in the Pacific and elsewhere you could go to, very often we are going to other countries to borrow, beg, and otherwise get supported as we seek to build our roads, our bridges, and so on, right? Now, if you're going to people elsewhere to rely on their savings to build your infrastructure, it is unlikely that you're going to find yourself in a position where you can set the terms, and those are the terms. Because the person with the money and with the resources that you require will say, well, you're coming to me. I did not come to you for assistance. And since you need my assistance, here are the terms and conditions under which I am prepared to assist. Now, in that, the person who is lending you support is not primarily interested in your well-being. They're primarily interested in their future well-being by reference to what they're providing for you. So what they will say to you, even if it is not explicitly said, is that, well, you may want to educate 90% of your population, but that is not going to help you to repay me my loan. So you may only be able to educate 75%. And there are those other conversations at all times. The emerging economies, as they consider their development agendas, bearing in mind that they very often have to rely on others, are sometimes in a position where they would want to go down a path A, but the circumstances require and force them to go down a path B because that's the only way they're going to be able to get a way of financing their development. And the truth is that without finance, your development won't go anywhere. And you know, in his articles of finance in the 1890s, the then premier in England, he said, finance, so to speak, is the heart of the economy from which all other organs take their tone. What does that tell me, or tell you, or tell anybody else? That you can have the fondest and greatest dreams and ideas. Unless you find a way of underwriting it, it will never happen. Because we live in a society where underwriting is critical. You have to get raw material, you have to get supply of goods and services, you have to do a host of things. And for each of those, when you go to a supplier, the supplier is saying, how are you going to pay me? And you have to develop and devise a plan to pay. And so who you get your sources of financing from, since they want to be repaid, are then going to say, since we know it is the essential requirement for your development, we have a heavier hand in this process to try to help you to direct where you go with it. So the real conundrum for developing country and their policymakers is how to serve the best interest of your population, while at the same time recognizing that you really have to tiptoe through the raindrops to be able to do the best you can for your population, while at the same time not jeopardizing the long-term objectives without which you cannot move, and the development is necessary for that to happen.
That was what I was going to ask, because I say that would put some sort of a stop to what you see in terms of the government or the ones who are borrowing the money on your country, because you see the country going a particular way, but because you are under this contract, do you believe that that also has put for want of a better word, a damper on a society?
Michael Manley published a book called Up the Down Escalator. And those were the issues he raised there.
Right.
You're constantly trying to go up, but you are doing so against an escalator which is coming down. How do you progress? And you are not able to progress in many instances at the level you would want to, because the conditions that are imposed on you from without, over which you have exogenous factors, as we call them, over which you have limited control, are the ones saying that if you want to get to A, you must follow us in this way. And it is unfortunate as well that as small economies, we very often do not have much of a say at the bargaining table.
Right.
So we have limited resources by reference to our number of people, by reference to size of our economies, and we have very often very little which will tell somebody that you are so indispensable to our needs that we must bend over backwards to satisfy you. Typically, that's not the case. People are saying, well, you know something? We have the resources, you need them. But here are our conditions. Do you want them or do you want to reject them? And that is the up, the down escalator model. So we have to bear in mind that that is a significant policy conundrum for all governments finding themselves in the position where you do not have all the resources you need to finance your ambitions.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's now move over to disputes management. So can you tell us what are some of the considerations related to contractual provisions?
Well, if we're thinking about in the context of development, there are essentially two types of dispute management needs that arises in the context of development. Yeah? There are those which arise at the level of what we call investor-state type arrangements. And I'll get to that in a minute as to what that means. And then you have things which are much more of a purely commercial nature. Now, the considerations are a little different, but connected. Mm-hmm. So, and in that process as well, you have to introduce something else. For economies to grow and develop, they also need to engage in trade. Now, in that arrangement, where you now have to think of what are some of the limitations and what are some of the things that you have to do there. If you're thinking investor-state arrangements, typically these arise under what we call multilateral investment treaties, MITs, or under what we call bilateral investment treaties, BITs. Now, those typically are arrived at between countries or among countries, depending on whether it's multiple or simply two. And what they will typically do is set out what the nationals of their country will be entitled to in the event they choose to invest in another signatory country. Mm-hmm. So let's say there's an investment treaty between Jamaica and the US, and there's actually one. Right. Under that investment treaty, it will say that if a US investor were to come to Jamaica, they would be entitled to get the better of national treatment or equal treatment, whichever is better, in the context of their investment. So if an investor in the US were to come to Jamaica and say, invest in a bauxite mine, let's just say that, and something happens where they feel they have been deprived of rights that they should have got under that arrangement, it is for them to bring, and they're able under the investment treaty to bring investor-state dispute matter against Jamaica. Why? Because the way these investment treaties are written, the host state, being Jamaica in this instance, which is hosting the investor, right, will then be entering into that arrangement which says, we are guaranteeing you the protection. And if you do not get the protection you need, then you have a right to claim against us. And it does that because there is this arrangement, which I will not go into in depth here, that says that the parties themselves, once you go into that, there are implicit types of contracts and so on engaged in where the state agreed to be bound in particular instances, right? So what happens there is that those sorts of treaty arrangements, which then become breached if they do, then give you the right of access to an investor-state dispute settlement system, which is operated through the World Bank. And there you will have matters being brought typically for breach of mining arrangements, for breach of energy arrangements, for breach of all sorts of arrangements. And when you go there, matters are heard in an arbitration tribunal to determine who is entitled to what. Then, of course, you have in addition to that, you have in addition to the investor-state settlement systems and their arrangements, you have a situation where investments typically involve things which are considered to be purely of a commercial nature. It's not so much under a treaty, but by reference to the fact that, yes, the investor comes in and he decides to bring in some heavy-duty equipment, which he plans to use and to sell and to do whatever with it. And there's a breach now of those commercial arrangements. Then you can go into commercial arbitration and other methods of settling disputes, which can be there. But what comes out there is that you have defined arrangements which typically are provided for either under the contract or by reference to a treaty. And even where by reference to a treaty, they're usually contractual arrangements as well, which are backing up the provisions that are included on the treaty.
Okay. All right, Doc, we're going to take a few minutes and we're going to look back at the JAIAC hosted Coffee Time webinar that took place in April, which also looked at this topic that we're speaking about. So let's have a look.
An attendee to this webinar might well wonder, sort of what is the role of lawyers and of disputes lawyers in particular when you are having these critical discussions about capital, about policy, about structuring and encouraging investment. And the answer, I think, is threefold. One is what Ambassador Hilton highlighted, which is that investors considering allocating and committing their capital to Caribbean markets, as to any markets or jurisdictions across the globe, want to have a sense of confidence that there is rule of law, that there is a framework, an avenue, and a certain amount of predictability with regard to the efficient resolution of disputes. Because as you said, at least some disputes will inevitably arise, and you do not want them to become hurdles to accomplishments of the shared goals.
Really interesting and informative details coming from that clip. And don't forget, you can go to the JAIAC's website and YouTube channel for the full-length coffee time video. Let me also remind you that this is the JAIAC's Dispute Management in the New World podcast, having a conversation with Dr. Christopher Malcolm. So, Dr. Malcolm, anything stood up for you in particular in this clip?
As you think development, you have to think of various options, for example, in relation to financing. Because as I would have said a little earlier, at the heart of in any investment, any development strategy, is the idea that you cannot do without financing. Financing is critical. It's absolutely critical. Now, when you think of financing, there's several approaches that one could take to financing a development. And typically, financing for any project, be it of an investment, commercial, or other nature, is of three essential types, two really and a hybrid. It is essentially of the nature of either debt financing, which is borrowing money, loans, or equity financing, where people bring capital investment to the project. Or it could be what we call mezzanine financing, which is really a hybrid of the two. So it includes aspects of debt and aspects of equity. Mm-hmm. Now, each will have its own unique considerations. If persons are coming with equity, for example, they are going to come expecting a significant return on their investments. Otherwise, why would they invest? Why would they take equity unless they're going to get a long and sustainable value in a project? Mm-hmm. If they come with debt, and we sometimes forget this, we talk about repayment, but repayment, as we recall with debt, is about repayment of principal, accrued interest, and penalties as they become due. And so we now have to start thinking in that model, what do we do? And sometimes you then try to see how can we merge debt and equity, always with a view to getting the best deal possible. There are parties or persons involved, each with their competing interests, right, each with their competing ambitions, each with their own expectations of the project. How do you then put together an arrangement which is geared to managing expectations, geared to providing adequate protection for the parties, geared to providing certainty for the parties so they know what to look to and what it is that they're expecting to achieve? And how do you then communicate that and effectively document that? And this is where dispute management practitioners come in a lot of the times as lawyers. Mm-hmm. Because at each stage you have contracts. And what is a contract? A contract is simply an arrangement entered between parties, which is capable of being enforced by a court of law, subject always to applicable law. Mm-hmm. And it is sometimes oral, or it is sometimes documented in writing. However, we suggest that certainly for any project of a big investment or commercial nature, you would never simply rely on word of mouth. You're going to properly document it. So if you're going to document, how do you translate an idea into something which is properly captured in a document, giving all the levels of protection that you require? And that is where the lawyers come in. But for a lawyer to do that, what must the lawyer do? The lawyer must be aware of the type of project that you want to enter into. And if they do not have the experience day one, they must be prepared to learn and be prepared to engage support as well that will help them to come up to speed with what the type of investment is. So if you're, for example, investing and the investment involves, let's say, an oil rig, There are persons across the globe. You may not have seen an oil rig before, but if the persons come to you, let's say the government comes to you for support, it behoves you to then go out and engage the services of persons who have done work in the oil rig industry. So they can tell you where the bodies are buried. What are downfalls that are likely? What are the areas of concern that you should have? How should you best document? What are the international and other implications to consider? And bear in mind as well that it is unlikely that any major investment is going to be simply contained in a single jurisdiction and have no connection whatsoever to anywhere else in the world. So what dispute management practitioners will do is to assist the parties to ensure that they understand, one, what the critical risks are. So that is getting back to my IAM, which I tend to speak about, which is identification of the critical risks by reference to the specifics of a project. Identification is never an abstract. It has to be by reference to the specific and discrete thing that you're talking about. And having identified that, how do you ensure that there's proper allocation and pricing? Because the moment you allocate, you have to price for it as well. You know?
Right.
Nobody is going to absorb a risk without being paid for it, if we're thinking rationally. So that is going to be priced into your model. And having allocated and priced, the question is, how do you then ensure that you have adequate systems for the management or mitigation of risks, and ultimately for the resolution of these disputes, which inevitably, or if they do, will happen from time to time. Yes? So that is that process. And in the dispute management side of it, the dispute management practitioner cannot simply be thinking about, well, this is the law, this is the this and that. The question is, what are the financial objectives? What are the models that are in place? What are the people requiring? How do I assist them? How do I engage them? How do I enable them to get exactly what they want in the most sustainable way possible and in the way that will bear them the greatest fruit possible?
Well, Doc, you kind of took away one of my questions. What are the contract provisions that you have for dispute management for the parties?
Well, the contract provisions, and again, this is something which I think we often overlook. In a traditional sense, we used to hear persons speaking of the dispute management clause in a contract being the midnight clause.
What
the
is
arbitration
that?
clause. And yes, that's a story to it. The fact is, people think of what the commercial objective is that they wanted. That was the traditional thinking. And you try to go out, let's say it's about selling paint. You think of how many gallons of paint you want to sell, what the chemical components of the paint should be, what the tin should look like, and all these other factors, and you ensure that they're properly accounted for, because those are the critical elements in and out of quotes from a business perspective.
Right.
Having got to the commercial arrangement, and people now determine how much money they're going to make under the contract, they then simply say to one of their associates or something, now that we have dealt with all the critical elements of this contract, go and find a precedent for dispute management that you think could work. In circumstances where what? That person may never have been involved at all in the negotiation process, does not understand what it is that the deal is about. So instead of notes ensuring that dispute management is central to it, you take an approach which is that the commercial side is important,
right,
but the dispute management side is not, therefore you keep them out. And there's an interesting story about when the Uruguay round of negotiations were happening in relation to the GATT. There was a point where persons felt that lawyers were simply a hindrance to development and things happening, right? So they decided as economists that they were going to draft the agreement without the critical involvement of lawyers. Having drafted it, they realized that at the end of the day, you have created a legal document which needs enforcement by reference to laws. And they realized soon enough that all that they had done required legal input which still had to be brought in any event. So the moral of the story is this, that much as you may try, you cannot avoid the impact at one level or not of the law, and by extension, dispute management professionals or practitioners. And therefore, my own view is that because it is so central to everything else that you're doing, you should bring them in at a critical time so that they understand what you're trying to achieve, and therefore then can help you best to say, well, you're thinking of building a house, and you may be thinking of arbitration, but what about mediation in these circumstances? What about neutral evaluation? What about having a hybrid of these processes? So the person there who understands that yes, the commercial objectives may be good, but if you don't get the contract right and you don't get the provisions right, you are doomed to eventual failure. Can say to you early, since you could be doomed to failure if you do not do A, B, and C, we suggest that you give it due consideration now and effectively bring it in. Because one of the things you also need to remember is that the worst time to talk to anybody about changing the terms of anything that you have agreed is when a dispute arises. Mm-hmm. The best time to talk is always at the point you're negotiating because everybody has something to give at that point.
Right.
But after a dispute arises, one party or the other is going to say, I look at what has happened and I have my rights. At that point, if I think I am absolutely right, why would I want to engage in a process with you of trying to give you something that I think I don't have to? Especially if I have securities and guarantees that I can rely upon.
So it's best to get it done at the beginning before.
It's
so
always best, and it is advised because that is when you have the greatest leverage. And one of the things we need to bear in mind is that dispute management options are options that can be leveraged in support of sustainable growth and development. And I'll give you a good example here. Let's say, for example, you're building a house, right? Mm-hmm. And you are borrowing money to build it. The developer is also borrowing money, right? At that point, if it is that the contractor stops the work, you have borrowed money from the bank, and interest continues to accrue while nothing is happening, and it takes you 2 years to complete it. By the time you finish the house, you probably have to give the bank the house anyway because you have lost everything. So what you can then do is ensure that you include a dispute management provision in the thing that can, for example, say that even if there's a dispute, as we try to resolve it, there can be no work stoppage. And that's a simple example. And that can be built out and expanded upon. But by doing that, you're then able to take away some of the contingencies that you have to plan for. And what we do know is that if you're able to remove contingencies from your balance sheet, you have much greater access to your cash flow. And if you have much greater access to your cash flow, you have to borrow less. And if you have to borrow less, you have much less money to pay.
Exactly.
And the thing is there. So there is an element of dispute management which is not properly canvassed very often as to how, by understanding it, you can learn how better to leverage it in support of what it is that you're looking for, which is profitability, growth, and all these things. And we could go into that conversation at some other time. I know we're absolutely out of time.
Completely out of time. And we've learned so much. But right before we wrap, could you remind everyone how to contact the JAIAC?
The easy contact is simply to go to the website, jaiac.org, and there you will find all the information you need about the JAIAC. In addition, you may contact the JAIAC by phone from anywhere in the world on 876-416-5390.
Thank you so much. Like we did in the beginning, we wrap things up with a repeat of today's quote. Conflict and resolutions are two sides of the same coin. Please remember to check out all of our podcast series episodes on dispute management in a new world, available on Buzzsprout, Podbean, Spreaker, and the JAIAC YouTube channel. Until then, I'm Roxene Nickle, and on behalf of Dr. Christopher Malcolm and our production team, thank you for tuning in.
This program is produced with the kind sponsorship of the Jamaica Deposit Insurance Corporation, JDIC, protecting deposits for you and me.
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC Deposit Insurance Scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
Special thanks to ADEB Consultants Limited, consulting engineers practicing for over 40 years. iNeutral, dispute resolution made easy. CP Malcolm Dispute Management Practitioner. Caribbean Institute of Alternative Dispute Resolution Limited, CIADR. Mona Law Faculty, the University of the West Indies, Mona. All our podcast episodes are distributed via these platforms: Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, Podcast Index, Pandora, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, and wherever else you get your favorite podcasts.